Hello, my name is Larry Sherman, and I am greatly honored to speak to perhaps the first annual meeting of your Society of Evidence-Based Policing that has not been held in person, but is being posted online. We're all getting used to doing new things in this new normal. And I will try to make the best of my time with you by sharing the screen with some slides I've prepared to talk about some of the heroes as well as the heartache in evidence-based policing. The reasons that we exist have a lot to do with the heroes who have demonstrated the leadership necessary to push forward with more knowledge about how to do policing better. But we're certainly facing a fair amount of heartache, not only from COVID, but from many other challenges to the rule of law and to democracy around the world. So I'd like to reflect a little bit on that, about the connection between the heroes and the heartaches, especially in relation to August Vollmer, who was the police chief of Berkeley, California, a great innovator in many areas, including the introduction of university-educated police officers, the idea of having a radio in a patrol car so that police could be directed by radio to go to different locations. In a sense, he's the father of dial-a-cop and 911. But he was also the first police leader or even criminologist to receive a medal from the National Academy of Sciences for his contributions to public understanding of how science has an important role to play in policing. He was the first professor of police administration at the University of Chicago, a famous Nobel Prize winning institution, and then the founder of the School of Criminology at University of California at Berkeley, and indeed the founding host of the American Society of Criminology. There is an award given in his name every year by the society. Most people who receive it have no idea that it's being named after a police leader. But I was fortunate enough to receive that award lately, and I am making a campaign to try to proclaim him as, in a sense, the spiritual forerunner, the person who made the idea of thinking about policing acceptable and understandable, and without whom we wouldn't have evidence-based policing. I'm also conscious of the fact that my mentor and great champion in evidence-based policing, Anthony V. Boza, who has recently turned age 92, has been one of the great heroes of evidence-based policing by pioneering the conditions under which police can do experiments. And especially in his 9 years in leading a very famous Midwestern police agency, he was able to produce, I think, more randomized controlled trials per 100 officers than anybody else in history. It'll take a long time to meet that record. The studies that were done under his leadership included one reported in the New York Times, which became known as the Minneapolis domestic violence experiment. If you get the slides to this lecture, you'll see the story in the New York Times, which was the original report of that result, and about which many further studies had been done to see if the results could be confirmed, that arrests reduced repeat domestic violence. Some years later, the New York Times covered the Milwaukee domestic violence experiment, which was replicating the original domestic violence experiment in Minneapolis, and looking at our evidence that it was actually increasing domestic violence among unemployed people. 30 years later, we still have the experiment that Tony Boza, our hero of evidence-based policing, made possible, with the experiment still being quoted in the news. If you go to the recent Slate online magazine publication, The Hi-Fi Nation, a philosophy professor at Vassar, who I'm not sure was alive when the original experiment was done, led a very interesting conversation about it recently. If you start at minute 24 at that link, you'll hear some very important reflections on the relationship between evidence and police practice in the United States, what it's meant for women, what it's meant for domestic violence. It was also under Tony Boza's leadership that the first Hotspots Patrol experiment that David Weisberg and I did in his city in the 1980s, and which became the basis for what the most recent Campbell Systematic Review has found is 78 eligible studies of the effects of additional policing or in more intensive policing in small geographic areas that have high concentrations of crime. So Braga, Turkin, Papachristos, and Hero could not have done that work if it hadn't been for our hero of evidence-based policing, Tony Boza, in the Minneapolis Police Department, which clearly is a source of heartache as well as heroes. We woke up this morning in England today to see something I never thought I'd see, a police station that I'd been in during the time we were doing research in Minneapolis, being set on fire by protesters for the narrative of the response that the whole country, the United States, has had to the unnecessary killing, as it seems to all observers of the video, of an unarmed Black man earlier this week in Minneapolis. And it raises the issue of whether evidence-based policing has something to say about this kind of heartache, something to say about the problem in West Midlands Police, which is another cradle of evidence-based policing and the police agency in which the Society for Evidence-Based Policing was founded by Alex Murray in 2010. If we look at today's Times story of London, we see that there is a rogue officer under investigation by the National Independent Office for Police Conduct, allegedly involved in 4 incidents of excessive force with substantial evidence over a relatively recent time period. And the words rogue officer are used in the article to describe what is being said about this officer, who has continued, at least through a succession of incidents arising from which the controversy is so intense. Is there an evidence-based policing of rogue officers that we can bring to bear on these kinds of problems, on the kinds of problems that cause this kind of pushback against policing? It causes serious scholars in the United States to publish books called The End of Policing and to call for the disbanding of police agencies, not just in Hong Kong over issues of political relationships with Beijing, but also the basic loss of faith by so many minority group members and young people in policing in the United States, that we have to reflect on why evidence-based policing is important in the context of an ongoing legitimacy conflict with respect to the impact of rogue officers on all the other officers. And so I do want to mention the recent contributions that I've been able to be associated with in developing more evidence-based policing around these black swan incidents, if you will, these rare events that have a huge impact on the image of the police as fair and trustworthy. I'm very happy to say that in the context of COVID and compliance enforcement, the latest findings in the Metropolitan Police across the board show an increase of 81% trust in the Metropolitan Police Service, up to 86%. And the increase has been biggest among Black citizens in London, who have been surveyed by telephone in this time period as a change from previous surveys face-to-face. Nonetheless, it's an enviable level of trust in the police in a very diverse city that many cities in the United States would be happy to achieve. And in that context, I think it is important to compare the limited numbers of police fatal shootings or killings in London, largely associated with terrorist events, to the over 1,000 people killed by police in firearms incidents every year for about the past 8 years, according to today's New York Times compilation of the data on these killings. And it is in that context that earlier this year, we published a volume of the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science, which is now open for free access at the link on the right. Says free access to June 1. And it may go on after that. So give it a try, or through your university if you can connect to the journals. In the webinar for the Annals volume that was put online this week, we had a 1-hour discussion with several of the authors of the contributions to this volume. And I would commend that to you if you're interested in this issue of evidence-based policing of rogue officers. Here we have, for example, Linda Zhao at Harvard and Andrew Papakistos at Northwestern University, who have analyzed 247,150 complaints against officers in the Chicago Police Department over a multi-year time period. On the left, what you see is the network concentrations of the officers who are getting complained about in the presence of other officers who are also being complained about in the same incidents. And there's a surprising amount, at least to me, of complaining, that is to say, people who are subject to complaints in the same incidents and who are linked in repeated incidents that result in complaints, which begins to get us into the territory of, are these officers different from most officers? And if so, what should we know about them? Well, in the article on who is more likely to shoot in the Chicago Police Department, what Zhao and Papakristos show is that people that network analysts call network brokers are much more likely to shoot somebody, to shoot a citizen, than other officers, even if they've had complaints, but who are not linked to multiple officers who have had complaints. And this process of betweenness, that is being linked to a number of people who are also linked to, in this case, people who receive complaints, police who receive complaints for misconduct from members of the public. The interesting feature they discover is that the network brokers are people who, for one reason or another, are much more likely to have been transferred. And for those of you who are familiar with big police departments, you would have heard the idea of transfer as a way of, quote, solving the problem of an officer who keeps attracting complaints. If we can get him into another location, maybe he won't get into as much trouble. Maybe that will minimize the risk from this officer. It turns out that actually it maximizes the risk, because when they create new ties to new people in their new jobs, it may be that they're contributing to the situational pressure to shoot somebody when, in their absence, a group of officers might not have made the decision to shoot, and which would then have something to do with the issue of lawful but awful shootings in the United States, which is part of this huge difference in the number of people killed by American police compared to British or European police. Although certainly a major part of the difference is guns, as Daniel Nagin shows in his article. The density of guns in American states is very highly correlated with the number of people who are killed by the police with guns per capita, and suggesting that there's a kind of preemptive assumption that the people you deal with in some states are more likely to have guns, and so police are more likely to shoot somebody just in case they have a gun, as perhaps happened in the Oklahoma City case a couple of years ago. These network signs, incidentally, on the right-hand side, indicate where the brokers are linking people to their co-complainants. And the value of this work that Zhao and Papakristos have done is to help predict in predictive analytics who is more likely to shoot when it's perhaps not necessary, when the shooting necessity is marginal, where the public is very likely to call the shooting lawful but awful. In a similar vein, Greg Ridgeway has used a unique design of incidents in which some officers shot, but other officers didn't. So using 3 years of NYPD data, Professor Ridgeway at Penn looked at 106 incidents, all of which had multiple officers, in which at least one officer shot, but at least one officer did not shoot as well. So it's a design that controls for all of the situational factors about whether it is necessary or reasonable to shoot somebody to preserve life in a situation in which clearly some officers thought it was necessary to shoot, or at least one, and others didn't. And to use the odds ratio of officers in these situations who decide to shoot and who decide not to shoot is an opportunity to kind of not predict, but to have post-diction of what were the characteristics of those people who decided to shoot compared to those who decided not to shoot. And some of the very interesting findings, which I think contextually mean different things in different police agencies about gender and race of the officers. I'm skipping over here to go to some factors that I think are fairly universal in policing. And it's fascinating to see that officers who had 3 or more prior disciplinary actions also were 3 times more likely to shoot in these situations than officers who didn't. And if these officers had made 2 or more gun arrests, on the other hand, which is a pretty dangerous thing to do, arresting somebody for carrying a gun, and they did it twice, at least, sometimes more, those people had a 17% lower probability of shooting in one of these incidents of multiple officers, some of whom shot, others didn't. If they had 9 or more felony arrests, on the other hand, making arrests for very serious offenses, serious offenders, they were 38% more likely to shoot in these, let's call them ambiguous situations. But if they had had 10 or more misdemeanor arrests, sort of antisocial behavior, as we would call it in Britain, low-level offenses in which very often you need to get people into compliance one way or another. Arrest might be the last resort, but making lots of those perhaps gives officers experience in behavior management. Those officers were 74% less likely to shoot in these controlled situations. So this is another way of getting at the question of who might be a rogue officer, who might not be a rogue officer. So you wouldn't want to take any disciplinary action just from predictive factors, but you might want to consider what the career path in developing officers who are at high risk of shooting or killing somebody might be based on big data. And this brings us back to the relationship between evidence and heroism or leadership on the one hand, and evidence and heartache, because Minneapolis certainly produced a lot of evidence. And there's some indications they've used a lot of evidence in more effective ways to prevent serious violence. But what is not clear is that having been a cradle of evidence-based policing left the Minneapolis Police Department with an institutional culture in which it was important to preserve life as much as possible. This is the second major internationally known incident of police killing somebody in Minneapolis in the last several years. The preceding one being an immigrant officer who had been involved in an incident with an Australian immigrant in a neighborhood very near where Tony Boza lived in South Minneapolis, and who shot right over the hands of the driving officer in the car when the woman came out to talk to the officers. And she died, and he was prosecuted, and there was lots of leadership shakeup in the Minneapolis Police Department. And now we have this terrible incident in Minneapolis with not even with a gun, but with choking somebody to death by using a knee in their neck. The evidence that was produced and used in the Minneapolis Police Department, the kind of evidence we want in evidence-based policing, clearly is not enough to create the kind of policing by consent, policing with public confidence, that is something that we also gather evidence about. Clearly, the evidence indicates that leadership is essential. And if you go to the Wikipedia page for Tony Boza, you'll see him described as not very well liked by his police officers, but liked by his community. And the idea that he was being tough on the officers in relation to what the community wanted to achieve out of their police helps to explain why, in my 9 years of flying out to Minneapolis, sometimes weekly, from where I lived in Washington at the time, Tony Boza saw himself in a culture war. He saw himself as keeping a lid on police brutality, which he saw as the widespread view of what is appropriate policing in the department that he inherited in 1980, which had had a series of insider chiefs, 4 of them still working in the police department when he got there, as the first outsider chief coming in from the New York City Police Department, which had operated to a very high standard of internal affairs control over police misconduct, a period after the Knapp Commission in really wiping out organized police corruption and reducing the number of people shot to death by the New York City Police Department in 1971, where the baseline was about 93. And by the time he left the New York City Police Department, it had fallen in half due to initiatives of Patrick B. Murphy and other commissioners, and continued to drop now to the range of 10 per year. He was from a force that had achieved substantial reforms and tried to do the same thing in Minnesota for 9 years, after which he was replaced by insiders. And since then, there have been repeated major lawsuits and prosecutions over police brutality. So how do we interpret the role of evidence from a cradle of evidence-based policing with leadership that didn't last or wasn't succeeded by the same kind of leadership? Certainly, since I'm giving this talk to both the American and the UK Society of Evidence-Based Policing, we have to notice that there are horses for courses, as the English say. There are people who are just right for a kind of situation, a kind of task, and they will get that task done better than other people who might do something very good in a different context, but not in that particular context. So the context in the US, in contrast to the UK, is there is no national oversight body for police complaints. The FBI may be investigating criminal activity or violations of civil rights under color of law, but it's not the same as the Independent Office of Police Conduct in England and Wales. There's certainly no inspectorate of constabulary across the US or even in any of the 50 states, although I did recommend that to the Obama task force on the police in 2015, that each state could have an inspectorate of constabulary similar to Her Majesty's Inspectorate in England and Wales. More importantly, and perhaps more immediately, there is no register of struck off officers across the United States who are legally incapacitated from further work as public police officers. And that is something that has developed and become more authoritative in the past 10 years in England and Wales, with the College of Policing operating such a registry, so that as of 2018-19, the most recent year, 253 officers were added to this list that now has about 2,000 people in it, who are not allowed to be hired by any of the 43 local territorial police agencies in England and Wales, as I understand that legislation. And so with about 2,000 people in total who have been banned from police work out of roughly 120,000 police officers, we're looking at roughly 1.5% of the potential police force, had they not been struck off, who would have been thought to be rogue officers by the standards by which they were removed from their current employment in a British police agency. Now, the Yale Law Journal has just published an important study of what they call wandering officers as part of a sample of 98,000 officers who worked over a 30-year period for 500 police agencies in Florida. And what Grunwald and Rappaport concluded is that what they call wandering officers, officers who have been fired from one police department and go to work for another police department, and sometimes several police departments after being fired several times, they conclude that statistically, wandering officers are more likely to be fired from their next job than officers who were hired as rookies or were hired as veterans, but had never been fired in a previous police agency before they had their current job. They were also more likely, people who had previously been fired, to receive a complaint in their next job for a moral character violation. So we certainly have measurement, we have indicators, we have data that can suggest, not just within one police agency, and for the 18,000 police agencies in the US, it's important to think beyond any one police agency, even in the 43 in England and Wales. If we think about evidence-based targeting of rogue officers, we might see that the early warning systems of stress or divorce or drinking or other problems may not be enough, especially if they rely on subjectivity in checklists with small samples, and not on things like statewide registries that would tell you if an officer has been fired before for road rage or other serious problems. If we had statewide registries with a big data analysis like the Yale Law School study in Florida, the UK could use the kind of information it has, not just as a kind of filing cabinet of people you shouldn't hire, but as a big data source for how those 2,000 officers now who've been struck off the police rolls in the last 10 years, how did they differ from other officers who were not dismissed, who were not fired? What did we know at the point when they were hired? If the UK used the same kind of big data that the Yale Law study did in Florida, after all, they had 98,000 officers, the UK has about 120,000. In England and Wales, we could be doing the same thing, looking at the kinds of factors that were known about officers when they were hired that might have predicted a different result of their career than officers who weren't ultimately put on the struck off register and barred from further police work in England and Wales. But the way you do that is through big data and using predictive risk analysis with harm assessments based on evidence, much like the Durham harm assessment risk tool for people who are brought into custody suites, looking at thousands and thousands of cases, so that we wouldn't think that Minneapolis is unique in terms of having rogue officers. They might be unique in other respects, as in failure to take strong action in response to public outrage or other commentaries one might make about the leadership in Minneapolis police involving a number of people over recent years. But we also have to recognize that the rogue officer problem is not unique to Minneapolis. It's not unique to any particular agency, even in the Met with 86% trust level in 2020 after COVID and 81% before COVID. We had the incident in 2009 during the G20 summit protests, and Ian Tomlinson, a news vendor who was knocked down and ultimately died of a heart attack when a police constable was videotaped pushing him. This was a police constable who had a long history of problems, who was later found by judicial process to have committed an unlawful killing, prosecuted by CPS for manslaughter. The prior complaint history and disciplinary record of this officer is typical for a rogue officer of the kind that was studied by Greg Ridgeway in New York City, by Andrew Papachristos and Linda Zhao in Chicago in the studies that I mentioned to you. So I think if we want to be serious about evidence-based policing and its constant threat to police legitimacy from rogue officers, in any large population, there will be rare events. We don't need to call them rotten apples or whether the barrel is rotten as much as we want to think statistically about what it is that can be done to prevent this kind of harm from rogue cops, and whether evidence-based policing can be seen as a major part of the answer that hasn't been tried in the UK or the United States. So if the question is, what use is evidence-based policing? One thing that we have to keep coming back to with the targeting of the 3 T's is that evidence is better at predicting rare events, and recent research by Jeff Barnes has shown that algorithms can outpredict the experience and judgment of police officers, at least in classifying offenders, the algorithms built in Durham being much more likely to detect very dangerous people than experiential judgments, which tend to cluster people towards the central tendency. And it's at the tails of the distribution, spotting very low risk people and very high risk people, that algorithmic analysis, evidence-based predictive analytics can be doing a much better job for policing, including policing the police. So if prevention of rogue police officer behavior requires prediction, and prediction requires evidence with analysis, one first step is to try to strengthen the analytic capacity of police agencies. And our aim at the Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing is to try to give a thorough 1-week course on evidence-based policing to over 1,000 police analysts by 2022. Because of COVID, we've developed an online course that is 40 hours worth of content spread over 5 weeks of access to the online platform. We're making it available both for police sergeants and other leaders, as well as a more intensive data analytic exercise focused course for the largely civilian analysts who'd be working with police agencies. So just Google Cambridge EBP, and when you go there, you can hear some testimonials from analysts who have taken the course, at least in person, and an EBP leader, James Sutherland in Cambridgeshire, who talks about the importance of all the leaders in policing being familiar with the analytics that are used by evidence-based policing to produce better policing, and we could hope in the future better police. Thank you very much for watching online this year. Perhaps next year, without COVID-19, we'll be able to see you in person. Thanks again.